So hello guys and welcome back. We have another episode of our Pioneer Deck Tech in the format in which we go again with these colorless mechanical creatures which we call the robots. We can say this one as our artifacts Aggro by L1X0, which I got from a list in MTGO League, a recent result which got into the top contending top finishers deck in that format. So we're going to check the lineup. First off, we have Giganta as our companion for this deck. So Giganta again has no cards in your starting deck, has more than one of the same mana symbols in its mana. So basically, having these kinds of colorless creatures will basically go with that condition. So now for the artifacts, we have basically divided the creatures in the basic non-creature artifacts in this build. So we have 25 creatures that is composed mostly of artifact creatures and 9 non-creature artifacts with 5 enchantments, instant were only 1, and 20 lands in this goal. It's quite the usual build. We go with remember the deck back in the day with the blue-red artifacts in standard, in which the land base were also be given the range of 20 to lesser to up to 18. The lesser land builds, but more particularly going with Springleaf Drum as its main mana fix. So for this Springleaf Drum, it's very also important that we have 4 copies of this in the deck to make sure that your early creatures can do the mana fix by adding those mana of any color, in addition to tapping this artifact. So again, we go first with the creatures. Our variety of 1-ups here, or the 1-drops, are Bomat Courier. So this is a 1/1 for 1 haste artifact creature construct. Whenever it attacks, exile the top card will be face down. You can't look at it, and you may pay red, discard your hand, and sacrifice Courier. You will put all those cards exiled with your Bomat Courier into its owner's hand. So basically a good 1-drop NSA, but also gets you to fill out your hand. Once you will be able to dump out almost all of your several 1-ups and 2-drops in this deck, which can also go with refilling your hand with this creature. So we need 4 copies of this to make sure that early on and in the late game you will have a good source for your hand to refill via this creature. So 4 copies of that. We also have 4 copies of Ginger Brute. It is a 1 to cast for 1. 1/1 haste also, and can be blocked this turn except for creatures with haste by paying this extra 1 colorless or 1 generic, and then you may pay 2 tap, sacrifice Ginger Brute to gain 3 life. The good thing about here is that you would not be really be blocked because of this condition, and early on can also chip out early damage because of its haste ability, which you can basically attack on turn 1. So what I mean with that would be not only do extra damage, but for instance where you would need to do a huge chunk of damage, you can combine Ginger Brute with Michiko's Train of Truth's ability to put the target creature +1 for each artifact enchantment you control until end of turn. So that is the condition we're in. Ginger Brute would really shine to deal that much damage, whereas evading almost all of the opponent's creatures with this ability. So we make sure 4 copies of that so that we can have extra copies later on to use. And another one of 1-drop per se, because of the 0-drop abilities on Ornithopter. So this is now a generic 0-2 flyer in most of the artifact builds back in the day, even in the Legacy and the older formats. And so you can also use this one as an evasive and a damager per se in this deck. So with that, we go with the 2-drops. We have Patchwork Automaton as the basically the best 2-drop in this deck, because of its ability that whenever you cast an artifact spell, you will put a +1 counter on it. It has also a built-in protection with the Ward 2, wherein if it will be targeted by a spell or ability and opponent controls, you would need to have the player pay 2 instead, in addition to that spell or that removal's mana cost. So basically, early on it can be protected itself and only would die in combat damage in case that you would need to attack or block in certain situations. But with this curve on turn 2, you can have several 1-drops or more 2-drops later on. For example, you can play Ghost discards this cheap artifacts for the hole, and also Springleaf Drum to pump out your automaton. So in addition to that, we have also 4 copies of the 3 drop. This is basically the 3 drop because of its prototype ability. You're still set up from Murder's War. So this basically becomes a 3/3 flyer with ability to trigger the beginning of combat of your choices to go with flying, vigilance, or lifelink at the end of the turn. So in certain situations, it would be really relevant, especially the lifelink ability, to do against the damage race against your, especially against your aggro opponents. So 4 copies of that, and later on, if needed, the cast 6 for 5/4 would also give you the option of this creature. And also the last one of copy here with basically mana cost of X is the Stone Coil Serpent. It was one of the staple cards back in its Thronable Drain days in Standard because of its ability that can basically reach trample protection for multicolored, and you can go early on or pump enough mana to go with its plus and counters. But on this build, since it's also basically an artifact creature, you can go with any situation where you would need to cast this one early on to block a multicolored attacker, or go big or go wide in the late game by placing all of your mana in X to make it more bigger threat, with also reach and trample at the same time. So that is for your creature lineup for the artifacts, and we go with the lone non-artifact creature in this build, which is Indigenous Smith from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. It is a 2/2 cast 1/1 Hermit Advisor that when enters the battlefield, you will look at the top 4 cards of the library and you may reveal an artifact card from among them and put in your hand, and put the rest in the bottom in random order. So whenever one or more artifacts enters the battlefield under your control, put a counter on Indigenous Smith, and only triggers once its turn, but at the same time it becomes a threat, wherein you get to guess, or you get to choose an artifact from the top 4 cards of the library, and at the same time, whenever you cast those or an artifact enters your battlefield under your control, you will get Indigenous Smith bigger and bigger and becomes also a good attacker in a setup. So that is also a gas and an attacker at the same time with the same functionality. Now for artifacts that are not creatures, we have, as mentioned, Springleaf Drum for the mana fix and ramp, Polterable Hole as your lone removal in the Smeared deck, because you can also exile aggro mashups in most of the aggro decks or non-land permanents that are mana value 2 or less. And we also have a lone copy of the one artifact equipment. This is equipped creature gets ++1. That is your Ghostfire Blade. In its ability would cost 1 less or 2 less if you are going to equip it to a colorless creature. So this one was the combo of the deck I mentioned earlier with that of Ornithopter, where you can just pay 1 to have your Ornithopter becomes a 2/4 flyer, which can also deal early damage in the turn with its evasion. Now for your enchantments, we have 4 copies of the Magical String of Truth. This is basically the huge artifact pump or pump source of damage in most of the situations, because its early triggers will get you to +1 for each of the artifact and or enchantments you control, in which you would also trigger twice because of the Saga 2, which also has the same effect, and at the same time it becomes a creature or portrait of Michiko, wherein it gets +1 for each artifact and enchantments you control. So also not only a good damage source, but also provides you a creature later on. Well, hence it was considered as a 4 copies in this deck. And the lone copy of All That Glitters, which also has the same effect that gets +1 for each artifact and or enchantment you control. But the good news is that this one is an aura, which pretty sure makes up to have this permanent pump on your colorless creature or even in your Indigenous Smith for that setup. And last but not the least is a lone copy of one counter spell. I'm not really sure why it's going one in the main deck. It's a lone copy of Spell Pierce to counter any relevant threat that is non-creature, and also protects your own if ever you get to get those pump with the spot removal, and just counter it with Spell Pierce. So for 20 lands, it's mostly composed of white because of Steel Serap's double white condition and its prototype. There are still a few mana fix with the Pathways, the Hallowed Fountain, that is Pathway. We also have Mutabolt as a added attacker with the 1 to cast activation only. We also have 4 copies of Spire Industry that can add mana of any color if you control an artifact. Just pay 1 life from the setup. And of course, a Darko Waste as another pain land but it's probably used in certain situations which you can go if you are needed to cast white or blue in this setup. Now for your sideboard, this is just basically going straightforward, which I really like on this build. We have 4 Unlicensed Hearts first. It is the 2 cast artifact that can basically deal with graveyard shenanigans by exiling them, and also becomes a good threat by itself, with each power and toughness would be each equal to the number of cards exiled with it, with only crew 2 activation. So 4 copies of this to make sure that your Phoenix matchups and Grisfang's decks would be really irrelevant in this one. That is also comboed with this counter spell, this long counter spell of 1 drop Stubborn Denial, which becomes ferocious if you control a creature with power 4 or greater. So in certain situations, you may have that ferocious ability in this deck, but early on, this is just a very cheap 1 to cast counter target non-creature spell in control phase 1, which can also be really relevant in most scenarios in the Pioneer format. So in addition to that, we have a good spot removal with Declaration in Stone, in which it will not only exile a target creature, but also all other creatures with the same name as the creature, and that condition also only would be having them to investigate for each non-token creature that was exiled. So that means they would give them a clue token, but that's not really the purpose here, since you can just really go with an aggro and just aggro them out before they can get to benefit from those clue tokens that was generated. And last but not the least is the Antiquities War. This would, I think, would go with the mid-range or control matchups, because of instances wherein you would need to draw gas if your early threat has been dealt with. So we have this ability wherein you look at the top 5 cards of your library, you may reveal an artifact card from among them and put it in your hand, and then put the rest on the bottom of the library in order. At the same time, you have this ability in the Saga tree, wherein artifacts you control becomes artifact creatures with base power and toughness 5/5 until end turn. So basically, marching out, your spinning traps, your Feather Blades, and even your 1/1s would become 5/5s in this setup, and would basically attack for a huge chunk of damage if needed in those matchups. So sideboarding in, not pretty sure how this build, but I think Magicos Reign of Truth is being taken out in those control matchups, and is being replaced by the Antiquities War to give you more gas draws in your late game, and also have your extra non-creature artifacts becomes 5/5 threats. So that's about it. The mana curve is 1.7. It's very cheap basically. Just go with 2 drops, and the only 3 drops will be the Seraph, and just later on just basically combos of more 1 drops and 2 drops. The card distribution is basically white with blue, but the mana source very much enough to go with that mana fix. And tokens, so basically that's the blue token with these card drives. So I guess that's about it for this artifact aggro update for Pioneer. We can say this one is another version of the robots deck, which quite very innovative in my sense of setup. But we'll sure that we would see this one if you're a regular of these Pioneer tournaments. You can basically face this one as you grind on for your ranks, and any other play, maybe in Explorer, would also see this one in action as you go along playing in that platform. So let me know if you have any questions, comments, or recommendations in this build, so we can have a more detailed and thorough discussion of this one as we get to know more of the current top tier Pioneer decks in the format, and also other relevant strategies given for the Pioneer. So that's about it, guys. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and notifications bell on for more MCG updates and up to point news from the upcoming set. Thank you for watching again, and have a great day ahead.